All right, good afternoon, everybody. We appreciate your patience as we get ready to get the meeting started. We're going to wait just another minute or so just to make sure we give opportunity for others to join, and then we'll get started. And thank you for attending today's Fish Passage Rulemaking Policy Workshop. We'll go through some brief introductions here in just a minute and then get started. All right, it's 1:05, so we're going to get underway. So good afternoon, I'm Ben Floyd. I'm with White Bluffs Consulting, and I'll be facilitating today's workshop, and I'll have the rest of the team members introduce themselves, starting with Gabrielle Stillwater.
All right, thank you all for bearing with me through technology changes. Hi, I'm Gabrielle Stillwater. I am the Rules Coordinator for the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Fish Passage and Screening Division.
Morgan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Morgan Carlson, and I'm the Habitat Program Director for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Welcome.
Thank you. Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Jameson. I'm the Fish Passage and Screening Division Manager within the Habitat Program, Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Great. So next slide, please. So again, we appreciate that you've joined us today. This is a Teams live event, and so you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as we go along. If you'll use the chat function to do so, we'll capture those questions, and then we'll be able to share them and ask them at the appropriate times in the meeting. You can ask questions as we go along, and also we'll have a specific time at the end of the presentation to also answer your questions or receive your comments. So we'll receive your questions. I'll refer them to the appropriate presenter, and then they'll address them. And if other WDFW team members will also want to join in and help answer the questions, they can do so at that time. If you have any additional questions or feedback after the meeting, or even if you want to write more comments and not necessarily ask a question over the meeting, feel free to use this Fish Passage Rules at dfw.wa.gov email address. And we'll also be sharing with you the project website at the end of the presentation, and you can capture that for future information. Next slide, please. So today we're going to review a little bit about the background, some of the work that has happened prior to or leading up to this meeting today and the other meetings that we recently held. We have an overview of our process for today, which I'm covering right now, and also the process for rule development, where we are in the process, what's ahead of us, when will there be additional opportunities for public input. We'll share with you some of the policy analysis that has gone on and some of the recommendations that are included in some draft rule language that reflects Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's current authorities. We'll also provide some recommendations for outside of rulemaking, and then provide opportunities for general discussion, Q&A, and then conclude with next steps. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan, and she'll tell you about the rulemaking process.
Well, good afternoon again. So you may be wondering why the department is undertaking this rulemaking at this time. The statute itself, the law itself, has been on the state's books since the late 40s. However, recently, you may be aware the governor convened an Orca task force to take a look at the plight of Orca in our state. And one of the focus areas for that group was looking at the prey, the foods, largely salmon, that the Orca eat, and how to make sure that there are sufficient prey for those Orca and we're able to improve numbers. And one of the observations that that group made is that there are a lot of very good laws on the books, and it's an important part of those regulations to make sure that those laws are clear and transparent for everybody, that people know what they can do to be compliant and to help achieve the environmental outcomes. And so coming from that observation, they made a recommendation that the Department of Fish and Wildlife create a set of rules associated with this fish passage and screening statute. And subsequently, the legislature agreed and directed the department to go ahead and undertake this rulemaking. There's another component of this rulemaking which considers how information that we have now about climate change and the effects of climate change on streams should be considered when we're thinking about water crossings that'll be durable and effective over time. That topic was raised by tribal co-managers to the department within the last couple of years, and we made a commitment to exploring that topic as well at the same time that we're undertaking this rulemaking about fish passage and screening and how to make sure it's effective. Next slide. Some of you may be aware that although there are not rules already adopted for this statute, the Department of Fish and Wildlife itself has had a robust fish passage and screening program and approach for many years, decades even. And a lot of aspects of that program are very successful. It's firmly rooted in the idea of providing technical assistance to help people understand and create fish passage solutions and screening that are effective and durable. We also have a practice of trying to find additional resources, financial support, and other technical assistance agreements that we can bring particularly to small landowners. And so a main objective of this rulemaking is putting in rule all those aspects of our current program that we find to be working and successful. And so again, we don't anticipate major changes as a result of this rulemaking. Rather, our intent is to try to make it really clear and transparent for everybody out there. What are the fish passage and screening solutions that meet the department's current understanding of standards? And how do we make it really easy for people to comply and be very clear about the steps that we want to take to help people get there? I mentioned the climate adapted crossings, the climate adaptation information earlier. That's one new piece that is a growing part of our existing program. And as you'll hear later, the science that has been done, that we've done in conjunction with the University of Washington, is robust and certain enough now that we are working with you, with tribal partners and stakeholders to try to figure out how to bring that into this rulemaking and help people understand how climate change and the effects on streams are really relevant to designing those structures. The last thing I'll call out here that's part of our intent is making sure that the tools and responses that are about helping people comply with this law, that part of the rulemaking is really carefully considered and reflects both the legislative direction and our own intent to be focused first on technical assistance and voluntary compliance. And what are all the tools and the support that the department can give to others to help them comply with fish passage and screening requirements. That's an important part of this rule, and as you'll hear later, it's a big policy consideration is how to flesh out and really create a nice sequence of responses that the agency can give that really rely first on that technical assistance. So with that, as I pass it off, again, I just want to welcome you and thank you again for being here. I know it's not easy to have yet another video meeting in your life, and so we're grateful for your added time.
Morgan, before you drop off, we do have a question. If these rules are adopted, does WDFW have the staffing capacity to enforce the new rules and provide technical assistance? If not, what are the outstanding staffing and funding needs?
Thanks, Rob. Great question. I would say we have some resources and probably not as many as we would need to really achieve the outcomes that we want across the state for fish. So what the department does have is we've got a small team focused on screening Effective Fish Screens. That team is largely based out of Eastern Washington and has a stronger presence and sort of basis of technical assistance and financial assistance for screen owners there. We do have one team member in Western Washington. We also have an existing team that's really knowledgeable about fish passage standards, and provides training and assistance with fish passage data. I think the piece that is weakest or needs the most, probably needs to be expanded in order for us to really help with the technical assistance, is our presence of biologists throughout the state. And what we are looking to right now is the program that we have developed with the help of the legislature around a different permitting authority. And what we've found to be the strong model there is when we have biologists who can help with the technical assistance and site visits. And then for us to have what we call compliance inspector biologists who know about all those technical assistance and compliance tools and can help people comply with the law when there's a concern. Right now we have a model for that, those compliance inspector biologists, but that's not been funded yet, either for our other permitting authority or with a focus on fish passage and screening. I think there's some efficiencies that can be achieved so that as we train, we're able to hopefully get funding from the legislature and hire those compliance inspectors. They can have expertise in both our construction permit as well as fish passage and screening. There's a lot of overlap in expertise, and so I think there's some efficiencies for the state there. But again, we don't have all those staff on board yet. So appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Morgan. And Rob has another question, but we'll come back to that one later. So let's go on. Next slide, please. So this slide identifies the 3 rulemaking phases, basically the notification processes that are part of the rulemaking. And so in the beginning, there is the CR 101, which is an announcement that the agency makes in the state register to notify really everybody that rulemaking is beginning, and again, rulemaking for the fish passage rules for in this case. But that was published July 1st of last year in the state register. And that really kicks off officially the rulemaking process. We are now kind of in between the CR 101 and the CR 102 as we formulate the draft rule language, as we receive public input. When we get to the point where the state agency is ready to put out official draft language, the state then files the CR 102. That's the proposed rule language in the state register. And then we have formal public hearings where there's opportunity to provide input and testify or provide comment on the draft language. Once that information is received, the hearings are held, then the state considers the comments, makes any updates, and issues the CR 103, which excuse me, slow down. The CR 103, which is the final rule filing, and 30 days after that filing, then the rules become in effect. Next slide, please. So we had some introductory workshops. Many of you may have participated in those workshops or one or more of those workshops last summer, so June 23rd, July 29th. We've also had many informal follow-up discussions with stakeholders and partners where we received additional input, emails, and other communications that we've incorporated and considered as the agency, or the department rather, has developed the draft rule language. So currently we're holding these policy workshops to review the draft rule language. And then after this, there will be some additional SEPA review, small business impact analysis and cost benefit analysis. And from those processes and the input that's received, then the department will update and finalize the rule language and file the CR 102. Next slide, please. So Gabriel Stillwater is going to start off telling us more about the recommendations under current authority as part of the policy analysis that's been happening. Gabriel?
Thank you so much for the handoff. Next slide, please. So before we start talking about some of our policy recommendations, I wanted to cover at a high-level overview of the statutes that we'll be utilizing and some of the framework that we'll be going about with this. Obviously, RCW 7757 is going to be the primary statute that we use and has been the thing that directed this, but we'll also call upon RCW 4305, which is the technical assistance statute, and as we incorporate those, that's a really important component. I do want to say that you will see some language mirrored from the hydraulic code within this rulemaking as well, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned that we are going to be pulling some elements from the hydraulic code, I thought it would be very helpful for us to describe the big differences that are going on here. Most people are very familiar with RCW 7755, and that has to deal specifically with construction projects in state waters. And the associated WAC with that is WAC 22660, and those are also known as the hydraulic code rules. Now, it's important to note that the hydraulic code really only applies to new projects. And so on the flip side of the rulemaking that we're doing here, that's focused in RCW 7757, which is about fishways, flows, and screening. And there are currently no WACs or codes for that. That's what we're doing here today. So we're creating brand new codes for this. And it will apply to both existing and new structures moving forward. So that's kind of the fundamental difference that you'll see with this. Next slide, please. So these next couple of slides are going to talk at a very high overlook about what you can expect to see within the rule language. It's important for us to lay out those standards that Morgan talked about earlier, and the standards we have for fish screens are fairly straightforward, that all diversions must be adequately screened on a lake, stream, or river, and that's really intended to help with the upstream and downstream movement of both adult and juvenile fish. Particularly within this section, we are noting that if there is no water right, the Department of Fish and Wildlife will notify the Department of Ecology about that fact. When it comes to screening within the state of Washington, there are very close ties between the Department of Ecology and the Department of Fish and Wildlife when it comes to that. So it's important we maintain those good working relationships. And as I mentioned before, we pulled the standards from WAC 22660-250. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So when it comes to doing standards for fishways, there'll be a few new things, but a couple of things that you're already familiar with. Again, much like screening, we're going to ensure that it ensures upstream and downstream passage for adult and juvenile fish. And it does pull from the standards in 220, 660, 190, and 200. But what's going to be new with this is two definitions. One is for fishways, and that's a little bit more comprehensive and inclusive. So that'll include both water crossing structures and fish passage improvement structures, because there are subtle differences between the two. And also we'll be creating a new definition around what is meant by climate adapted water crossings. Next slide. So this gets at what is going to be new, hasn't been done in statute before. And as we talk about looking towards the future, it's important that we consider what design components will go into that. So as it stands right now, the language within the draft rules states that if projected models predict a 5% or greater change, then you must consider those needs for the structure when you're doing the design. If it's less than 5%, you can continue to use the standards that I've already defined, but not necessarily upsize your structure. And that's for specifically new and replacement culverts. Another thing that we've put within the rules is that existing passable culverts are protected or grandfathered in, if you will, during this process until they need replacement or significant repair. And part of the reason we wanted to explicitly call this out is that we recognize that addressing culverts is a pretty big task, and we want to make sure that we're prioritizing things correctly and making sure that individuals are doing the best that they can. So if we've got something that's not a fish passage barrier, we'll leave it alone. Next slide. And finally, talking about what is in the rule for compliance actions. As Morgan mentioned, a big component of this is going to be relying heavily on technical assistance. So much like the Hydraulic Code Authority technical assistance, you'll see a lot of that mirrored over here. We'll start with site visits, provide education and information, and really do our best to work with people on getting them up to speed about replacing their structure. If, for whatever reason, all of our steps to achieve voluntary compliance aren't beneficial, then we'll kind of look at steps to do enforcement. Within the language, we will start with a 30-day notice to comply. Many people are already familiar with this tool. One thing that is not included in this draft, but will be included in subsequent drafts, is the opportunity for individuals to respond to that notice to comply. It's important to let people have that discourse with us as well. Moving on from there, we are looking at sort of progressive actions that we may take. The first being civil actions with something like a tort claim, from there progressing to possibly public nuisance law. And then finally ending out with what the RCW states, which is the closure and or the replacement of the structure by DFW. And in some instances, DFW would be able to place a lien against the property structure owner to recoup those costs for us. We will say that this is a pretty severe action. These rules recognize that the statute, of course, was developed in the late 40s. And so we're doing the best we can to work within between those lines. And we're very curious to know in what circumstances why we apply these more severe compliance actions. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk briefly about what you won't expect to see within this rulemaking. Next slide. So within some of the compliance mechanisms, we are not able to issue monetary fines. We need legislative authority to do so. And so when we're talking about compliance measures, that's not something we're able to put in writing there. There are two other very important components to this as well, and that's prioritization and funding. And I'm going to turn this over to Tom Jameson to talk a little bit more about funding and prioritization.
Great, thank you, Gabrielle. Again, Tom Jameson. You know, as the slide indicates, this is fish passage is a very complex issue. In the January 2020 legislative session, there were 3 fish passage provisos. A proviso is basically in addition to a budget document, but there were 3 fish passage provisos. And the one in the capital budget tasked Fish and Wildlife DOT and the Fish Barrier Removal Board to develop a statewide, really an all new statewide strategy for the removal of fish passage barriers of all types. And so we've been working on that. Again, it's not part of this rulemaking, but of course this prioritization is related to it. Funding fish passage corrections is not part of this rulemaking, but you know, related in that we realize that fish passage and providing fish passage under our roadways is an expensive adventure. The typical cost of a county road crossing is about $1.2 million right now. So it's an expensive effort. As part of this rulemaking process, we'll be doing what's called a small business impact statement. What that really is that we contract out with a non-state firm, and they will do an economic study on the impact of what these rules would be to property owners of all types. Gabrielle?
I think you're muted, Gabriel.
Oh, Chris Technology, thank you for letting me know. Thanks, Tom, for covering that last bit of this. We now like to move into the questions portion of the meeting. And if you go to the next slide, we do have two questions that we posed mostly to kick off. If this is something you guys are curious about, please feel free to use the chat. I believe we have a couple of people calling in on the phone, so feel free to ask questions as well.
Great, thanks, Gabrielle. And so just you can see the questions there, but what circumstances might trigger more severe compliance actions? What are preferred long-term options to Fishway when deemed impractical? So be thinking about those questions, but certainly you can ask or respond to any question, ask any question or provide any comment that you would like. So we are going to go back to Rob's other question, which is the rules aren't very explicit about how it applies to dams. Can you clarify what kind of dams these rules apply to? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can take a start at it, and then maybe Gabriel or Tom can add if they would like. So these rules apply to any structure that would obstruct the effective passage of fish species at all life stages as we've defined it. So one of the reasons that definition that Gabriel highlighted about our new presentation of a definition for Fishways, one of the reasons that's important because we are defining Fishways as the umbrella term, and that would include not only more small scale water crossings, culverts, box culverts, bridges, that kind of thing, but it would also include fish passage improvement structures. So for some of you that are more familiar with something like large dams, this would be what you would maybe commonly recognize as like a fish ladder. So it's a device that provides volitional passage upstream, usually for adults, and is often associated with one of those larger barriers. So when you look at the detail of the rules that we presented, that's one of the places where there's some mirroring with the rules and standards that are articulated in our hydraulic project authority for some of the different project types that provide passage. Hopefully that helps, Rob. Let us know if you have additional questions.
Great, thank you, Morgan. We do have another question. What civil action can the department currently take if you're unable to charge fines under current statute? Morgan, you could probably answer all of these, but do you want to give Tom or Gabriel an opportunity?
What, Gabriel, would you like to take a first crack at that, and then I can add if that's even needed?
I will do. So thanks so much for your question, Rob. So the civil action that we can do under this is a tort claim because that's about a civil wrong. So even though it's not necessarily a monetary fine, there's another component to that. I will say we have never once utilized this statute as an agency before. So we're in a new place, and I would like to hand it back to Morgan to more eloquently possibly address that.
No, you did a great job. It's true that we have not used the tort claim aspect of the law. Just to be clear, we're definitely implementing the fish passage and screening standard components. But I would say, so in addition to the civil case, or bringing a tort claim as Gabriel described. We're also trying, and I think I mentioned this earlier, we're trying to make sure right now the law doesn't provide the nice sort of smooth progression of seriousness of potential government responses that we typically like to see, and that matches more of what we believe the legislative expectations are today. There's the voluntary piece, and this might be why you're asking the question. There's the voluntary piece associated with the technical assistance statute, and then there's fairly draconian responses relative to, for example, the department making a fix on private property and then placing a lien for the cost. The department has also never used that aspect of the statute, hopefully for obvious reasons. So in addition to the tort claim, we're trying to sort of flesh out, like I said, that progression of steps maybe more in the middle that allows for a sequence. The notice to comply is an important piece because that is a legally enforceable document. Gabriel mentioned tort claims. The other piece I would call out is that there's brief mention in the statute of the idea of a fish passage barrier as being a public nuisance. That's not an area of law that as an agency we have done a lot of work in, and so we're still trying to do some research and work with our legal partners to try to understand whether that can help flesh out that more smooth sequence of seriousness, I guess. But maybe, again, the reason you're asking the question, our civil tools are fairly limited. So comparing to our hydraulic project authority that you and others might be more familiar with, we don't have stop work order authority, and we don't have civil penalty authority, which are two of the other mechanisms under civil.
Great, thanks, Morgan. So we do have a few more questions that have come in. So there's a follow-up question to the question about whether the rules apply to dams or not. So thanks for the answer, says Rob. Does that mean these rules only apply to existing passage structure at dams, or would these rules require the construction of a new passage structure? Morgan, you want to take that?
Sure. I think the short answer is it may depend on the structure. So these rules, and forgive me, I can't recall the exact date. Gabriel might be able to help me, but these rules only apply to structures from a certain date forward. And so the reason I bring that up is that where a structure exists, a dam exists, and it doesn't have effective passage, and it's before the date indicated in this statute, then obviously the statute doesn't apply. And in those cases, what we do is we try to use our, relationships and influence and the possibilities of partnership to try to get that in place. The other thing I would point out is where sometimes, as Rob knows better than anyone, sometimes the larger structures are associated with energy, and they're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And in those cases, the federal law preempts the state law. However, we often have a strong opportunity to work through that process and be clear with the federal agency what some of the state requirements would be and work on getting those included in licenses. So maybe that's a little bit of nuance and detail, but it explains my it depends answer.
Great, thanks, Morgan. Another question, how does the department determine if a barrier is impractical to remove? Similarly, how will the department determine if passage is adequate or not? So first part, how does the department determine if a barrier is impractical to remove? Second part, how do you determine if it's adequate or not?
Great, so I'll take on this first part and then I'll allow Morgan to respond after me. These are really things we're interested from hearing from you. There's not clear guidance about what is considered impractical, and so it is our hope through these outreaches that people would have ideas and be able to share maybe some of their thoughts with us that we maybe haven't considered before. Morgan, would you like to also respond?
Mostly to say I think you're right on. We haven't applied that standard. We haven't applied that standard before, developed the rules. So as Gabriel says, really looking for suggestions and ideas. And there's, I think, a couple places in the statute where it mentions that largely relative to another archaic, I would say, piece of this law, which talks about the only remedy in lieu, or alternative in lieu of providing passage, being hatchery production, which is not necessarily consistent with how we think about when hatchery production is warranted. I think what this is, not in our rule language, but maybe more just me talking about kind of big picture policy perspective. I would like to see the fleshing out of the idea of impractical push pretty hard on more limited circumstances where have what we define as impractical be much more limited circumstances. Of course, there are going to have to be considerations of physical constraints at the site, or potentially cost relative to alternatives. But it's been fairly rare that something like cost itself, which isn't really related to sort of our concerns around fish life, is the main driver for practicality. So look forward to folks' ideas and suggestions about that one.
Great, thank you. Next question. It's my understanding fish passage evaluations are based on a swimming ability of a 6-inch trout. Is the department leaning toward all life stages, including juveniles, I guess, to consider as fish passage criteria?
Great, thank you so much for the question for that. Yes, we are leaning towards doing all life stages, and not just for salmonids, we're also looking at all species as well. Of course, as we're going through our standards, we'll need to incorporate new science as it develops, and that will be a really important part of this, but it is our goal and intent to do all species at all life stages.
Great, thanks, Gabrielle. We have a question from Justin. Is WDFW collaborating with the tribes on this policy formation? Gabrielle, do you want to? Oh. Gabrielle, do you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I can take a crack too. I wasn't sure if I thought I saw Gabriel's video go off. Yes, the WDFW is collaborating with tribes. That's a part of the state's commitment in terms of working with tribal co-managers on major policy development. So yes, we have had separate tribal consultation around this rulemaking, both at kind of the workshop stage and talking about the background information and providing, kind of getting on the same page about the basic fundamentals, much as we did with the public and with other stakeholders. And similarly, we're providing policy consultation opportunities to tribes along the way, much like today.
Great, thank you, Morgan. I couldn't tell if she was on or off, and then she was gone, so thanks for jumping in. And then just lastly, it looks like we just have one other comment, which is thanks for the responses. Sounds like some new legislation is needed to give you all the tools you need to be as effective as possible. I'll just ask, are there any other questions or comments that participants would like to make? So where do we go from here? Next slide, please. So we're going to be taking the feedback that we've received today at our other workshops. We're going to be receiving additional input. You can always send an email or go to the website and track what's happening and provide that additional feedback. Over the next several months, we'll probably be continuing to work on the language and then move forward with the CR 102 once the agency, the department rather, is ready to publish that. So we encourage you to keep the conversation going. Please continue to provide your comments through the email and stay tuned on the website for updated information as we go forward. Before we end, I do want to give a shout out to a few other folks that have been kind of behind the scenes helping with these meetings. And I forgot to give Jane Atha an opportunity to introduce herself. She is our climate change expert and has been waiting to see if there are any questions to be able to respond to regarding the climate change passage provisions that are going to be included in this rule. But I also want to recognize Rachel Blomker and Allison Hart and thank them for their behind the scenes work, making sure everything's running smooth, and also thank Tom Jameson for running the slides today. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Keep an eye on the website, and we welcome any additional comments that you have, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.